I am Johann Mettler, and today we will be looking at the logic informing municipal demarcation. We want to understand the why behind South Africa's post-apartheid municipal boundaries. We want to explore the policy logic, the political pressures, and the institutional drivers that led to the current demarcation model. And then we'll also reflect on the successes and failures of that approach and whether it remains fit for purpose. So today we have two respondents. Ashraf Adam, he is a governance expert and a former municipal practitioner, and also Michael Sutcliffe, former municipal manager and demarcation expert. Colleagues, welcome to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Johan. Thank you, Mike. Yes, colleagues, this is another milestone in that South Africa has had a very interesting history of local government and local government demarcation, given the apartheid era experiences of Black local authorities and in the management committees and so forth. So even though people stayed in similar geographic spaces, they were really governed very differently. So to take this discussion further, to check and understand how we got to where we are in terms of the types of demarcations that we have. Our municipalities are very large. We moved from over 800 in the apartheid era to what is now 257, I think, and which means that geographically a number of our municipalities are big. I think one or two of them, well, more than one or two of them are larger than a country such as Belgium. Geographically is, I think, the third or the fourth largest metropolitan area in the world, competing with Tokyo and New York. So they are very interesting thoughts that we need to explore. The conversation, Mike, will take place over 5 segments, from setting the scene down to your personal reflections. And I'll ask you around 3 questions per segment, but you can just answer and respond. You don't have to answer each question. You can just respond to the topic that we are trying to address. So to start off, setting the historical frame, maybe if you could give us some ideas on why municipal demarcation was a priority after 1994. What were the political and developmental aims of redrawing municipal boundaries? How did the work of the Municipal Demarcation Board unfold in those early years? And for listeners, if you don't know Michael Sutcliffe, then I don't know where you've been. But Michael Sutcliffe is a local government doyen and was the chairperson of the first independent Municipal Demarcation Board. And in that respect, led us through the process that concluded in the first democratic local government election in December 2000. So the first democratic elections for the national and provincial governments were in 1994. But for local government, the first democratic election was in the year 2000. And it's the work of the Demarcation Board that led us there. Michael, over to you, just setting the historical frame for us.
Thanks very much, Ashraf, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. If one wants to think of colonialism and apartheid as what they've done to particularly Black South Africans who lived here, probably the most important reminders of that is how the space of South Africa was carved up over many years. Carved up firstly, obviously, by the settlers who arrived here, the British, the Dutch, other settlers who arrived here, carved it up as if indigenous people didn't belong here. And then carved up by the apartheid governments, who again reinforced that indigenous people who lived here had no real belonging here. I remember as an academic how academics were employed to find evidence that white people lived here roughly the same time as Africans who lived here. So the way in which space was carved up, a critical part of the apartheid and the colonial legacy that we have today. The African National Congress, for example, was formed as a national body precisely because the Land Act of 1913 was about to come into law. And that was an act that said that Black people belonged in native reserves, even though Black people were found in all parts of the country, they were to be in native reserves. You then had, subsequent to that, you had the Urban Areas Act, which was designating Africans that if they were in the cities, they had to have a passbook and carry that around so that they could be told to get back to the area. Of course, many of them lived in the cities themselves, but they still had to be subject to that. Later on, it then was extended to other Black South Africans, people who were designated as coloured or designated as Indian. And that designation was done on the basis of putting a pencil in someone's hair and deciding whether that pencil stayed. If it stayed, they would be defined as black. If it fell out, then they could be defined as of European and later on as white people. So if you think of it, all of that was about starting to say that people, particularly Black South Africans, Black Africans, were in fact to be located in specific either native reserves, which became known as Bantustans and then known as homelands, or in fact, in the case of coloured and Indian people, that a street or some physical barrier between where whites would live and where Indians would live, people of Indian origin would live, that's the designation it did. So drawing boundaries was about discrimination, about this terrible legacy that we have of apartheid. Now, I don't want to get into the detail of that, but it's important that we recognize that. So when the negotiations occurred, there was a recognition that we must change that, and boundaries must never be in future seen as things that would divide us. Rather, boundaries are necessary to try and bring together local economies, make sure that they were functional in the sense that if people live together, they shop together, they went to whatever religious group they would, whether they were Christians or Hindus or Jews or Muslims, they'd be able to practice together there. So those were the kind of things, the background that we had to remove. Very quickly then, the Constitution then said because local governments needed to be developmental instruments of the state, it followed then that the new boundaries had to be ones that were inclusive, that brought together people and in a very new way, where the boundaries themselves were not going to say this side of the street you were an Indian and that side of the street you were coloured, and over that particular barrier you would be white, that should go there. So they decided to put into the legislation, and that's why our Constitution is quite unique in the world in that it allowed local government to have a space in the Constitution, and then it needed to also put into the Constitution how those boundaries should be set up. And because previously it had been done on primarily political and racist means, it said that there should be an independent authority that should act without fear or favor, who should be constituted to redraw those boundaries. And so that was the beginnings of what became the Demarcation Act, and then the first Demarcation Board in South Africa to be constituted around 1999. Of course, the elections had to be held for democratic local government. There was some transitional local governments before that, but those boundaries had to be constituted for the 2000 elections then. We'll talk about that a little bit now. So the work of the Demarcation Board was in terms of an act, and it was saying that we should think in developmental terms, we should think in terms of unifying people, and boundaries should not be a means of dividing people, but a means of uniting people at that level.
Thank you. Yeah, which brings us nicely to the next segment on the model and its rationale. What were the key principles or metrics that we used to define boundaries? How were historical injustices, the ones that you've referred to, the issues of urban and rural divides, service backlogs, because besides having different local governments for different race groups, there were also different levels of services. So how was service backlogs factored into the model and historical injustices and the various divides? And were there trade-offs between administrative efficiency and community identity that you had to make when looking at the demarcation process?
That's a very important set of questions there, Ashraf, because the Demarcation Act then was quite a big debate that we held in negotiating that act there. And we said what we're not going to do is, as many countries do, is to say that the community world should decide where those boundaries were. We came out of a period of centuries of discrimination, of racism, of sexism, of defining people, not allowing people to define themselves. We came out of that period there. So we said we're not going to have community will as one of the reasons for drawing boundaries there. because how do you define those? The apartheid state had said people who were Venda would be defined in a particular area. People who would be Zulu were defined in a particular area. And yet if you travel into KwaZulu-Natal, for example, you would find that there were more than 200 tribes that, yes, they were brought together under King Shaka as the Zulus, but they are very different people. And so that sense of community identity, for example, is not something that you can define easily. So the one thing that you will not find in the Demarcation Act is the notion of community will. All the rest of the criteria are relatively practical criteria. They revolve around developmental issues. How do we make sure that it brings together the tax bases? It brings together people who live and work and shop in one area there. Because remember, under the apartheid system, all those 870 odd municipalities were white municipalities. Black people who lived in the same area, they could go into the white areas to shop, but the income that came from the taxes or the rates of those shops were used only in white areas. A person of Indian origin lived in a group area, but they had no real say in the councils that existed there. And all they were allowed to do was to buy property in their area, which meant that they paid higher rates because their property values ended up being artificially high. And you found all of those challenges there. So developmental reasons, integrated urban planning, making sure that we, to a large extent, catered for physical boundaries, such as the topography of an area there, bringing together and making sure that the governance issues in that area could be practically managed, recognizing, of course, that because the majority of South Africans, because they were black, never had local governments serving them before. So how could you bring that together in a way that you could deal with it? So the criteria that were then developed were quite interesting. There were about 20 different criteria. We won't go through them in detail here, but they were all about how do we make sure that we enhance democracy, enhance development, enhance making sure that the objects of local government, which were primarily about giving people their democratic rights locally, that how was it that we could bring those together there? So it was about recasting a new period now where allowing people who actually lived in separate jurisdictions, but they actually shopped together. Later on, they practiced religion together. Much later on, they started realizing they're parts of the same communities that existed there. And that was always difficult. So when we looked at the boundaries, and as the first demarcation board that was established, we realized that we wanted to get these boundaries to be functional. And if you think of the word functionality and integration are probably the two most important things that we did. So are they functional from an administrative point of view, even a political point of view in terms of how you divide wards up and things like that? Functional from a people point of view, that they're integrating communities, etc. Those were really the critical issues that came in. No sense. The idea of urban and rural divides were not there, because that's how black people were divided from white people before, to say, oh, you live in these rural homelands, even though many of the, and often people were taken off farms and dumped in towns that had, in areas that had higher densities than even some of the larger white towns that existed there, and yet they were not deemed to be urban. So the notion of rural and urban didn't exist there. It was saying if communities are living and shopping and working and the transport patterns are suggesting that they should all be part of that municipality, or so be it. The demarcation board then decided that they would be part of those. And that's why we ended up with some of these municipalities being larger probably than you would see internationally, because it would have been completely unfair to have people who lived in Cato Manor, for example, in eThekwini, who were now dumped 30 kilometers away from where they grew up, to now say, sorry, you're not really close enough to the heart of the city of what's become eThekwini today. We will leave you out there. So we couldn't allow that. And so the demarcation board, in demarcating for the first time those municipalities, tried to bring together people that had something in common. And the thing that they would have in common is that, generally speaking, the transport patterns, the shopping patterns, the working patterns, etc., were bringing them together in those areas there. We clearly had to look at, and that was very difficult in the first boundaries that we produced, we couldn't think of administrative efficiency because there were no administrations that were properly serving black South Africans. Certainly once you got to the more rural areas, yes, there'd been these Bantustans established, but they were primarily located in the major towns of those areas there. There was no real community identity that existed at that stage that people could say, are they all part of this place, which is now called eThekwini, or another place called Tshwane, or another place called Kamagara? Those, of course, were not allowed under apartheid. And so you were defined as Durban, even though you were living in a place called Lamontville, which was cheek by jowl with the key industrial areas. But during the 1980s and before that, they had tried to carve that area out of Durban and put it into the Bantustan called KwaZulu. So it was about taking back the rights of those people to live in those areas there. So the administrative efficiency issues do come up, but there's no clear-cut evidence to say that a municipality should be a certain size. It's largely dependent on the competencies that you have in the administrations, particularly, less of the councils themselves. And all the evidence says it's issues around competency levels that improve efficiency. It's not about whether it's a big area or a small area. You can have a very efficient major area and a very inefficient small area. So those issues, all the international literature suggested that they weren't really the key issues. And that's why, obviously, to improve administrative efficiencies, another part of the Constitution said there needed to be an equitable share of income, that the national taxation base should be shared with not only national government and provincial government, but also with local government. Now, of course, today we're debating that very much, because the unfortunate thing is that the local governments, even though they provide most developmental functions in our country, they receive only about 8% of the total tax base there. And that's why there's often a complaint that the administrative efficiencies can't be realized because there's a lack of resources at a local level. But that's, I'm sure, going to be covered in some of the other podcasts.
Yeah. Now, an interesting point that you raised is that despite the fact that there were over 800 municipalities in the apartheid era, there were large parts of the country that had no municipal representation. I'm not even talking about even apartheid era representation, which is where the concept of wall-to-wall municipalities came across, that every part of the country must be part of a municipal area. And the geography you describe has resulted in a very unique situation. And I don't know enough about many other countries, but it's rather unique that in South Africa, we have what would be called rural municipalities having dense urban settlements within them, whether they are new informal settlements or the older areas, or you have metropolitan areas such as Cape Town, Buffalo City, which have large townships. In the case of Cape Town, might be Atlantis, way out there. And then you have all the rural areas in between, or you have them at East London, and you have all those rural areas in between, but they're part of one municipality. So it's a rather unique situation that we have here. So given that experience and the impact this has had on practice, what has been the most notable successes and failures of this demarcation model? Because it is unique, and there's a lot of learning and mistakes and challenges of how to manage dense urban settlements and deeply rural areas in one municipality that municipal officials have to deal with. So are there successes and failures around this model that you can reflect on? Did the boundary decisions help or hinder service delivery and accountability in the context of which I've just said? Because it is quite possible that a ward in a municipality can stretch over mountains. Just the reality. So how does a councillor service an entire ward and that kind of thing? And then how did demarcation influence local economic development, political representation? In other words, have the objectives that were set out that you explained earlier on in terms of the model and its rationale, has there been any impact on that in practice?
Those, again, are issues that we're still relatively young, but there's probably enough over the past 25 years that we can learn from there. And the reason I say that is that, as you pointed out at the beginning of this set of questions, you pointed out that the reality was that most South Africans and most parts of South Africa were not under local governments as we know today, where people were democratically elected to serve on councils. They appointed administrations got on with doing the job there. the majority of our country, the space, the area was not covered by municipalities. And so it had to be wall to wall. And it should have been, because no one should be excluded from that democratic system there. What were some of the successes? The first thing is, what was successful is that we got it done. And that could only have been done because we had a parliamentarians who wanted to get things done. And I remember we used to have Monday meetings at the airport in Johannesburg, where we brought together the members of the executive councils from across the country, the Portfolio Committee of Parliament, brought together a hodgepodge of people, and we drove that process. Our job was just to make sure that we could do it. We received an award as the demarcation board from Esri, which is the major GIS supplier, because we're probably one of the first countries in the world that used geographic information systems on a large scale to help bring together whatever data sources we could get, because we had to combine data from the existing homelands, because by then the census data was only for white South Africa. So we had to bring together data sources like that. So we'd have to go to Tata and try and find the records of traditional areas, for example, so that we didn't split those areas. So bringing that together, as I say, led to an award with us. I remember going to the Royal Institute of Commission of Demarcation in Britain, and I was absolutely shocked at them, as they were with us, because I immediately said, could we look at your GIS databases? And the fellow said, no, we do this all by first principles. And quite frankly, you can't do demarcation in terms of trying to bring together data sources to say how best is the arrangement that we would do here. So one of the successes that we had was certainly the way we brought together information. And probably for the first time ever in South Africa, we're able to use all of these data sets to start understanding a little bit better the communities that would become part of the new local governments there, that we would have there. Of course, the successes were also about trying to bring together communities that didn't want to be part of this new South Africa. I was part of a technical team looking at Oranje, for example, Oranje being a place where white South Africans wanted their own little homeland on the banks of the Orange River. There was a really interesting engagement in a place like that, in places like Mbulelo, where it's people who were Tshangana and had moved into that area after conflicts in what we would call today Mozambique, and lived there. And there was some conflicts, or they wanted their own, almost an ethnically based municipality there. So there were a whole lot of those engagements that we had to go through on the ground, meeting people there and trying to make them understand that, look, you might not, because you speak a different language, doesn't mean to say that you can't work together at that level with issues. So I do think that there were successes, partly because we brought together a wide range of information, but also because we got to that ground and tried to talk through with people that, listen, this is going to be a better model than one that divides people on racial lines there. Did the boundary decisions help or hinder service delivery and accountability? Certainly they did, because majority of South Africans had never had anything that was accountable. And the legislation, the Structures Act, the Systems Act, all demanded an accountable municipal structure to be in place there, which would consist of wards, which mean ward councillors elected locally, and then PR councillors to complement that and make sure that it was. So the result was that for the first time, people actually had a councillor that they were electing democratically, and that councillor was part of a bigger council, which then had to deliver the goods for them. So certainly they helped accountability, and it now meant that in all of these places, I mentioned eThekwini because I live there, but it meant that people in Umlazi were now part of the decision-making fabric. They didn't have to go cap in hand and say to the white bosses, listen, we would like to have a swimming pool. Remember at that stage, I think in the whole of Durban, where 70% of the population then of about 3 million people, 70% of that population or more were African South Africans, and they had one swimming pool in all of those areas there. Whereas in the white areas, which were maybe 10% of the population in this area, I think there probably were 30 or 40 public swimming pools I'm talking about. So that's the kind of difference that you had at the level of just swimming pools, let alone service delivery, where though the black communities didn't have parks as they were known in white areas, etc. And so in all of those areas, there had to be a way in which you got people to democratically start making decisions. And what was very interesting, and probably one of the successes, there wasn't a wholesale They're saying you white communities, you were getting services, let's say your garbage was being collected twice a week. You didn't suddenly have people saying, you've got it for the last 100 years. We're now going to get our garbage collected and we're not going to have you served there. What happened in those cases was to reduce. The model became one of, instead of getting garbage twice a week, try and get it once a week to everyone. Of course, there were difficulties because you had employees that had never served black areas before in terms of something like waste services. So you had to find other models as well as ways in which you could deliver those services across the cities. And so we became, in that first 10 or 15 years, a country that was coming up with unbelievably innovative models. The free basic services model, where everyone should be entitled to a free amount of water, of electricity, of sanitation, was invented because of that. New systems in which we could deliver water where there were no bulk services. So it meant that water that they got was potable, but it was not, didn't come out with the kind of pressure that you get from a bulk service dispenser of water. Whole sets of innovations were found there. And all of that meant that now it started influencing economic development, certainly at a political representation. Because these were bigger areas, it meant that you got all communities represented there. And so what was interesting about this was that from the first election in the year 2000, you had coalitions being formed. Coalitions, and we still had largely white and black political parties, but coalitions in the Western Cape, in fact, throughout the country. eThekwini was the first of the big cities that had a coalition in place. Now, almost all of our, except for Cape Town, I think all of the, maybe Buffalo City and Mangaung, but I think we have 5 of our metropolitan areas now have coalitions. So that meant people had to work together. And I think those were some of the things that well before national and provincial government thought of coalitions, that became part of the life of many parts of our country there.
No, thank you. That's very interesting. The one thing I found fascinating when you mentioned the use of GIS. So when I was working with the demarcation board for the first demarcations, we used GIS, but as you said, large parts of the country had not been mapped out properly other than through aerial photography. And we used those 1 in 50,000 topographical maps as the base layers. And what added the nuance was the statistics, the enumerated areas and the various counting districts or whatever it's called. And that was quite fascinating that we were able to then go down to a particular level of detail at the statistical level to support what was being seen geographically. So it was a really interesting experience. You were involved after the demarcation board did the boundaries. You were involved with the establishment, and you're obviously a veteran municipal administrator. Do you have any thoughts, Johann?
Yeah, but perhaps just a few. It was actually thanks to Michael that we were brought on board. Michael, I don't know if you recall, but you had insisted that you use university students or university institutions to assist. So that's how the then Community Law Center came on board with myself and the health officer and Professor Nicholas Statler. So I think the first thing...
Are you blaming me for that or not?
I'm thanking you, Michael.
You've stayed in the sector all out and done outstandingly yourself. So I'm glad that you did stick it out.
Yes, no, we stuck it out. But we went to a few municipalities, the status quo, to go and check what is on the ground. And it was my job. It was in George, it was Drakenstein, Swartland, and so on.
Yeah.
And it was my job then to go and speak to senior administrators.
Yes.
And everyone had the same story. They've been in local government for 30 years. This thing will never work. What you want to do will take years. And you know why mess with something that is actually working? So certainly from that perspective, although the majority of them actually worked with us, there's no argument about that, but you could sense that this transition was going to have to be fought for. And the example of that was when we had to go to Parliament to amend the Structures Act to stop the alienation of municipal assets. golf courses and like, I don't know, like if you can remember, golf
No, that's
courses
right.
were
Common and municipal common.
and municipal commonage areas.
Mhm.
Exactly. They were then let for R1 a year, with the municipality having to pick up the tabs for the
Yeah.
provision of services. So it was clear that the whole logic behind the system, and that is for resources to be spread equitably, was going to be resisted. And we had to put in place measures and come up with regulations in order to stop that, so that the MEC, for example, had to agree to the alienation of municipal properties. So I think that was something that was very clear to me, that the democratization is going to come at a cost, and we have to be focused on reaching the outcomes that we wanted to achieve. So perhaps just that for now, Ashraf.
Okay. So now, for both of you, and we'll start with Mike on this. Given the logics that you've explained and the challenges, is the same logic still helping us? Is it still working for us? Does it meet today's local government needs, given the fact that there's now a big review happening in terms of her local government over the next 25 years, maybe with this white paper process, and people saying that we should have more municipalities and smaller municipalities, or more urban municipalities and more rural. In other words, people are saying, look, the system as we have it right now should be reviewed, maybe have a one-tier system instead of a two-tier system. Are the logics of demarcation that you explained still applicable to us? Should boundaries be reconsidered in the lights of migration, urbanization, economic shifts? If you look at one of the key demarcation features was, as you said, economic integration and economic, there's a word for it. If an area, so for example, in Mdantsane and East London, let me just give that as an example. East London could only exist because of the people of Mdantsane, but the motor industry in East London is changing. The steel works in KZN are closing down, or was going to close down. So industries and economies have changed. Do those logics still apply? And are there alternatives or adaptive models that might be worth exploring now in the context of the white paper review? Michael?
I think my view is a simple one. I think that everyone blames, not everyone. Some people will say, it's because of demarcation that's this problem. Every single time, and I've tracked this for 25 or more years, the people say demarcation is the problem. I then look at it, and I then am able to explain to people that actually demarcation is not the problem. The problem might be competency levels. The problem might be the fact that you've got a non-responsive local government. The problem that might be that you don't have enough resources, or you've got poor financial management. Those are invariably the problems. The problem is not demarcation. I'm a firm believer that, and probably the only reason we had that two-tier system introduced for the non-metropolitan areas was because of the fact that we had a negotiated settlement. So the one thing I would change is to say, why don't we have a single tier and get rid of the provincial structure there? If we're going to be bold and say that we really do want to change the overall governance system, for me, I think that's the thing that we should do. Because I do think that having two tiers in the category A and category B and C, I think does create its own political, economic, other challenges there that you would have there. So for me, I wouldn't be saying change the demarcation logic. That's still there. I think that as we are finding out more about traditional boundaries or about policing boundaries or whatever, and quite a lot of it is happening there. I've been in discussions I was talking to the DG in the presidency a few days ago, and she was saying that at least now you've got the police are coming on board, realizing the importance of aligning policing boundaries with municipal boundaries. And increasingly already, I think education are doing that, health are doing that, and doing it very well there. So I think for me, the issue is not to change the demarcation logic at all. If we want to change anything to do with the structure, maybe think about getting rid of this, that part of our country has a two-tier system of local government than anything there. Because in the end, most countries of the world are moving towards a central state and a local state option there. If you go and look in Europe, for example, in a place like France, which still has the same jurisdictions from the French Revolution days, something like 35,000 local units in their local government system. But actually, you think of France as the metropolitan areas of Paris and of Lyon and of Marseille and that. And many of them start looking at what we did here and start saying, if they had the political will in their countries, they would far rather have this kind of approach to demarcation. So I certainly wouldn't change much in the way of demarcation. I would change the system and say, look, do we need that two-tier system outside of the metros, for example? Because the system itself works quite well where you do need to make adjustments to boundaries. Maybe we don't need to amalgamate, and because in the end, it's about whether we have good administrations, we have a political maturity, etc. Those are the things that make a municipality work. The boundaries don't make it work itself there. So for me, the answer is quite simple: to don't get rid of something that we've got used to that is working. Yes, it does mean that if you have one municipality that's doing well and the municipality next door is not doing well, then suddenly there's a clamor to amalgamate it or whatever. I'm saying get in and fix the problem of the one that's not working well, because there should be no excuse that a municipality has that it can't be working well. Whether it's small, whether it's big, it's got every opportunity to do that. And we can change the financial arrangements and improve the quality of staff, do all of those things, and that will often address the problems that are sometimes deemed to be demarcation problems.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, Mike. I have the same view that you have on the demarcation. If you look at the scale, the depth, the nature of the challenges that we have at local level, I believe that you can draw the boundaries any way you want to. You still have to deal with the same issue. And so the issue really isn't the boundary, it's the governance of what happens within the boundary.
Yes.
And that's where the challenges and opportunities lie. And that's where leadership comes in, which is the basis of this podcast and the book, that it's about leadership and supporting leadership to say, look, it's not about the boundary. It's about delivering services to the people within those boundaries, regardless of the spatial context in which they find themselves.
Absolutely.
Johann?
I would agree with you. And it's not because it's you, Michael, it's because of practical experience. As an example, Tshwane has issues both in the east and on the Mpumalanga side, Metsweding, and in the northwest. And that is simply because portions of land have not been transferred to Gauteng. It's about as simple as that. So it's got nothing to do with demarcation.
Yes.
Portions of land have not been transferred from Mpumalanga and from northwest.
Yeah.
And there are economic reasons for that. So we have to try and get, for example, a power of attorney, just in order to put urban in place for development. So there's a lot to do about that. I completely agree with you. Tshwane is the third largest, but it can handle that. We just have to get the administration and the leadership right. The can-do attitude must be there. Then we are fine.
Okay, so now we're going to, this has been about personal reflections, but a lot more personal reflections. And maybe if you could also provoke some discussion, I'll give you one or two of my personal reflections. The one is Stellenbosch, where we were going to incorporate parts of Stellenbosch, and we did actually, into what was going to be Cape Town. And the powers that be in Stellenbosch obviously wanted to retain their Stellenbosch identity and use the argument that our wines are designated a place of origin is Stellenbosch. And if you put us into Cape Town, then we can't argue that. And as a result of that, I had to go do a whole research on the concept of wine of origin.
Yeah.
And we were able to argue against a lot of these really racist and patronizing arguments on the basis of fact. So that was quite an interesting one. Then I also recall, because this whole process of working on demarcation would really open my research field. I had to, the demarcation board, I think it was yourself, Mike, appointed my firm, MCA, to do research on what was then called district management areas. And district management areas, for the listeners, was areas which was so small, it's so sparsely populated, but large in geographic area. And they really would be a millstone around the neck of a municipality. And then they became areas which were managed by the district in the same way a district might manage water, bulk water supply, and area had to be looked after. And these were large nature reserves and that kind of stuff. So These are very interesting concepts that one have to deal with in demarcation. What get governed? How is it get governed? How do you deal with the politics of people who are quite reactionary? You mentioned Mbulelo. I was on the board at the time, and there was real violence. And the chairperson of the demarcation board, she was threatened. She had to go in with security to go and conduct public meetings in those areas. So it was quite a thing. So let me hand over to you for some of your personal reflections and what are the disputes you remember most vividly? And if you are tasked with a new demarcation review, what would guide you? What new principles would guide you if there are any new? What advice would you give to there's a new demarcation board based on the new act that's going to come in? What advice would you give them? Let's start with Mike and we'll end with Johann.
We could be here all night with some of those, and I think you've touched on a few there. And what's been interesting in all of those cases is that in the end, as things have unfolded, people have changed their views. So that Mbulelo, for example, I remember getting a call from the then Deputy President, Jacob Zuma. During the demarcation process, he was up in Mbulelo and he said, no, you must meet him the next day. And I flew to Cape Town and saw him in his office. And he gave me this long story about the need to have Mbulelo as a municipality. And I then said to him, are we going back to the homeland boundaries where you define people according to ethnicity rather than that? Anyway, 10 years later, when he became president, it became an issue again. And that's what you're talking about. And I remember then being hauled in with a few other people to be on an advisory committee for the then Minister Van Rooyen. But again, when in the meetings I had in that, and that was very volatile, we went into classrooms that had been burnt down because of this issue, but it was really provoked by a few individuals, ironically, one of whom was actually married to a woman who was a vendor, but he was who was vendor, that's right, but promoting this issue of ethnicity as the basis there. So yes, we've got a few of those explosions that occurred. In KwaZulu-Natal, I had some very hot meetings here, obviously, with Amakosi in particular. But in many of those cases, I was able to say to them, just don't listen to people who are telling you something that we're not doing. And so in a few occasions, we had to stand up and say to people, look, here's the truth. The truth is that we're not taking away any land. The truth is that you already have what we call joint services boards in this province, and they were called regional service councils in other parts of the country. And a district is a little bit like that. It's bringing together different communities under those. So don't believe this argument that no, it's the demarcation board is now taken away your rights as traditional leaders, etc. So those are the kind of hot ones. But interestingly, in almost all of those cases, while there was a grudging acceptance initially, in the medium term, there's been an acceptance. And I think today you still have a few of these issues that spark up, but they often spark up where demarcation is used by people who have often very pecuniary interests about wanting to have their own municipalities or whatever. So at that level, I'm very happy that if you look at it, particularly from where we've come, we've been able to survive a lot of complaints about issues, but still, as I always say, the glass is still 85% full. That yes, there are problems in municipalities that we have today, but if you think of them, if you extract them all, it's probably only that 15% where we've got improved leadership, improved competency, improved resource, reduce the compliance regime that we have in our legislation and the like. Those are the things that we've really got to focus on to make a difference there. So I would say you don't need new demarcation reviews. Yes, you might need to look at the macro organization of the state, whether we need provinces, whether we need some two-tier systems or not, that you can deal with. But the demarcation itself, I wouldn't say you need to deal with it. For new demarcation boards, and that one example that you gave there is one that I remember encountering as well. But it's interesting, and I haven't studied this, even though I study bottles of wine. I don't study wines of origin. But actually, if you look today, I now see on the wine shelves when I go, wine, you now see the one of origin in Swartland or whatever. And I don't ever remember those had been promoted the way they are today. So it'd be very interesting for someone who's got time. You live in the Western Cape. Maybe you should do a little study of that, because I once did 2 weeks with some professors of geography in France. and we ran seminars for 2 weeks, about 10 seminars, but it was in different wine regions. And I was fascinated there because quite often you'd have a small little village. And remember, France has very small municipalities when you're out in the sticks there. And often on this side of the river is one wine of origin, this side of the river is another wine of origin. And because the soils are different, etc. And so it was a nonsensical argument there. And I'd love to see today how many wines of origin you have today than this fight over Stellenbosch that we had there, because it's today, I think you've got plenty more there. The advice I'd give there on reform commissions, I'm a firm believer that there's a lot that's working. We must be very careful that we don't raise expectations. There are issues we've got to deal with, but I think that they're relatively small in comparison to this idea that it's a grand reform that we deal with there. Because in the end, I think as we explore all of these issues that start coming on the table, we realize that in fact, we have legislation in place that deals with it, maybe too much legislation. And that's the area of reform I would be arguing for. How we would measure demarcation, I do think that instead of creating, and I argued strongly against the amendments to the bill at the moment, they've increased the number of criteria for demarcation. My argument is it should be reduced to 3 or 4 criteria. One, that it should be around enhancing administrations, making administrative issues. One issue should be around development, integrated development that you would have. One being around making sure that you're bringing together the functionality criteria, commuting patterns, etc. It should be 3 or 4 fairly straightforward criteria rather than this list of criteria there, because some of them are pretty meaningless today and others I just think are not necessary. Let's keep it at a general level there. But other than that, I think that we've survived it.
Yeah. No, I appreciate your point on the demarcation criteria. I think that that list of criteria is a bit too long, in that it does open up the demarcation board to all kinds of legal challenges. And I'm surprised that more people haven't gone to court arguing that the criteria hasn't been properly applied or this aspect of the criteria has been ignored and that kind of stuff. So if you have fewer, then you can interrogate those in more detail. Whereas if you have a long list, in most cases, you could end up, I'm not saying the board does this, I don't think it's ever done that in my years of association with the board. It could just end up, you check, okay, we've done economic functionality, we've done social compatibility, whatever the list of criteria is. Whereas if you go for the kind of categories of criteria, I think that would make a big difference. Johann?
Okay, I'll be short and sweet because I'm very mindful of the time, Ashraf. So my takeaway after all of this and having been in the system since 95 is that we really have to focus on leadership and implementation. So that when it comes to, for example, demarcation, there must be equal effort placed on who is going to lead this on the ground, who is going to do what, and how are we going to measure that the purposes of demarcation are being met. And we are assuming that. And I think through those assumptions, we are now at the stage where we start questioning the original demarcation instead of looking at the lack of leadership and the failure to implement. So there should be a very deliberate focus on that, and it should be between the demarcation board and the relevant provinces, that they would need to set very clear expectations of what should happen, who should be responsible for what, and then making sure that it happened within 1, 2, or 3 financial years, so that we can speak about the real issues, and the real issues are really in enhancing service delivery. So for me, that is my takeaway.
Fantastic. No, thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Johann. This is another really good conversation. And again, towards the end, the guidance for those coming after us to say, look, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Demarcation is not the issue here. It's building, it's leadership in building a society at local level, building local communities, this dreaded phrase of social building, social cohesion, and making sure that people get their services. At the end of the day, that's what people want. They want to be able to live in peace, and they want to be able to know that the electricity is going to go on and the sewage works. Thank you very much. Very enlightening conversation. Thank you.